The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of Coke Kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. You hear the name Leroy Dumbrell being up before the courts for an assault, and it's hard to believe that he's only on a 2-year sentence. He's been up and down to the courts 81 times over the years, and obviously is very well known to Gardaí, very feared. I mean, I recall that alerts were sent out every time he got out of jail to the area where he settled, because he moves all over the place. He seems to go from relationship to relationship and has a tendency to move in with women that he's with at the time. He's lived out in the south side of Dublin. He's lived in the inner city. He has a self-professed drug addiction problem and this propensity for violence, which just seems to kick off every couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, he's still only 37, but of his adult life, which is, just under 2 decades, the majority of that would have been spent in prison. Even in the prison system, he would have been one of those guys who developed a reputation as being extremely dangerous, has been involved in riots behind bars. He's a big guy, strong guy. We had a few times, we had pictures of him from prison where he's, obviously, very built up. But yeah, one of the most feared prisoners within the system. He obviously comes from one of those families that have been very notorious. And yeah, he was described as having a propensity for violence this week. And yeah, he was given a 3-year sentence ultimately.
So let's have a little look at the Dumbrell family and, where they came from and who some of Leroy's brothers are. Because I suppose the most notorious of them has to be Warren Dumbrell. He's currently serving a life sentence along with his brother Geoffrey for the murder of a 33-year-old father of 6, Christopher Cawley. And that was in 2006 that they murdered, or they were certainly found guilty in 2006.
Yeah.
Now, Warren Dumbrell was the first of 7 brothers born to Colin and Margaret Dumbrell, right? And the father basically has an impressive criminal record himself, but he would have been somebody who had a tendency to drink and come home and come in and out of the home. The mother, Margaret, sort of had to bring the kids up largely herself. She moved around the city a little bit. Colin Dumbrell, unlike Margaret, hadn't grown up in a tenement. He was one of these kind of cuckoos in the nest. He was a very wealthy kind of a guy. Yeah,
but he came from a wealthy background and sought out another life, I suppose, is fair to say, which is unusual, but it does happen from time to time. Obviously, most people that get involved in very serious crime, they grow up around that, and that sort of grooms them into it. But there's a few people that come from very, privileged middle class backgrounds who find their way in. Obviously, Dumbrell wouldn't be a common name in the working class areas of Dublin. So there was a lot of young of the Dumbrell boys grew up in Inchicore, and they had a reputation for violence at a very early age. Warren Dumbrell, I think at one point in his early life, may have suffered an accident, and there was talk that he'd maybe suffered a brain injury. But for whatever reason, he became, certainly at the turn of the century, one of these really, really feared criminals. A scary enough looking guy, but one of these people that even in the world of gangland and in the world of the prison system, there are these people that people are afraid of physically because they don't feel that they're operating by the normal rules, I suppose.
Well, he was. I mean, I think the parents were only in their very early 20s when Warren was brought home, and they were living in O'Devany Gardens at the time. But Warren was, the boys came one after the other. There was a couple of girls, I think there was twins, but the father was in and out of prison, and it was one of those kind of haphazard, I suppose, upbringings. When Warren was 15, he was actually doing a thing called scutting on the back of the Guinness lorries that passed along, and he was with some school friends, but he lost his footing, and one of the wheels of the Guinness lorry drove over his head, and that was in 1989. And like, friends in school sort of said he disappeared, obviously, to recover from this horrific injury, and when he kind of came back to school, he had changed. That's what they recall.
Yeah.
You know, at 16, he was sort of still recovering from those injuries when he started to rack up a load of convictions for burglary, for road traffic offences, and for stealing. And he sort of tended to go on these binges of crime.
Yeah.
He'd, as a teenager, actually, he was caught with a firearm, which was showing kind of the direction which he was going to. But he was violent to sort of frail members of society. He'd rob elderly people. He was sort of known as that sort of a opportunistic criminal who'd target absolutely anybody. And he was in jail in and around 1997, say.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's in and out of jail, but he's in jail in Mountjoy in 97. And he finds himself sort of coupled up with, or in the same wing as, Paul Ward, who has been brought back from the UK as part of the Gilligan gang to face charges in relation to the murder of Veronica Guerin. So they're pretty notorious. And Ward is very cross that he's facing charges. He believes he had nothing to do with it. He's going to beat these charges. John Gilligan is still on the run, and the prison itself is hugely overcrowded at the time. I think the prisoners are slopping out. So between himself and Warren, they sort of got together and presumably conversed about their complaints, about their sort of human rights, and about how they were, forced to share buckets as toilets and all this. And they hatched a plan. And that was to hold prison officers hostage and to carry out a siege in Mountjoy that was going to bring attention to this situation. And they did it. And it was one of the most horrific stories that we can recall. And I'm sure one that prison officers still talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably a defining moment for the prison system. Effectively, 5 prison officers were held captive, while Warren Dumbrell was threatening them, I think, with syringes at the time. He was telling them, I have AIDS, I don't give a fuck, I'll make you drink my blood. He also threatened to slash and slaughter them.
And hang them.
And it probably made Warren Dumbrell one of these famous inmates because the prison guards certainly believed he was capable of it, I suppose, at the time. Paul Hippo Ward was ultimately, he was ultimately cleared on appeal, I think, in connection with the Veronica Guerin murder. But Dumbrell was, he was one of 6 high security prisoners in this kind of segregation unit, which, there's obviously these prisoners that are regarded as highly dangerous. And he was described ultimately as the ringleader of this riot,
which went on for 53 hours.
Yeah, so it was a huge
it
story.
Involved the prisoners on the roof, and this mock execution happening to the prison officers. And I think John Lonergan was the governor at the time, and he was on the phone. He actually had always a good relationship with the prisoners. I think he brought in some of the mothers to try and talk to them. And eventually the Department of Justice agreed that they would investigate their complaints of human rights abuses around the toilet usage and the overcrowding and all the rest of it. And one by one, these terrorised officers were released. Many of them, I don't think, ever went back
No.
to work again.
I mean, they described in the court case, and Dumbrell was ultimately, he pled guilty to one count of false imprisonment. But one of the prison officers described how they were told they had no chance of escape, and rioters tied a rope made of duvet covers from a radiator to the door of the separation unit, and the officers were in fear of their lives. And one later said he made his peace with God because he believed he was going to die. So while Warren Dumbrell was notorious enough at that stage, just that kind of level of violence sort of catapulted him into being, one of those really, feared, I suppose, the most feared prisoner in the prison system.
And all the while, some of the younger members of the Dumbrell family started to come to prominence as well. And of course, when he got out, Warren Dumbrell hooked up with his younger brother, Geoffrey, who was 6 years younger than him.
Yeah.
And they were ultimately caught and put on trial and convicted for the murder of Christopher Cawley in 2006. Now, what happened in that case was Mr. Cawley had bled to death after being stabbed 6 times in the back, hip and thighs during an attack that was witnessed by his wife and 2 of his children.
I think that was one of the most shocking things, and I did speak to some of the witnesses. I remember meeting them, and many years after the event. And I think that was the most shocking part of it. I mean, this man was butchered to death.
Was this over drug debt?
Well, it was over, disputed amount of money, let's put it that way.
Because the Dumbrells would have been, certainly Warren Dumbrell when out, would have been a small-time street dealer as well.
Yeah, I mean, they were very much small-time. I mean, these weren't good. So, I mean, you're talking...
organised criminals.
No, and you're talking about a very, so this guy died basically over nothing. Then in the aftermath, as they were arrested and charged, there was a huge, because it wasn't one of these crimes that are committed with forethought or planning, there was a lot of, there was witnesses, and there was a huge amount of intimidation went on.
In the aftermath of that trial, that the Court of Appeal overturned those verdicts because of a lecture given to the jury by the trial judge. But ultimately, the 2 brothers were tried again and found guilty a second time in 2011 for the murder of Chris Cawley.
Yeah, I mean, it was a controversial decision at the time, but they were convicted and they're both serving life. Now, in recent times, it has been said that both Warren and Geoffrey their behaviour has improved, but Warren is still regarded as being one of those very high security inmates that is, a danger to the prison staff.
In the meantime, Leroy has been in and out of the prison service, and another brother, Thomas.
Yeah, and another brother, Leonard. So those 3 brothers certainly have appeared before the courts. Leroy came to, I suppose, the media attention in part because of his brother, but at the age of 20, in 2006, he robbed a man of his mobile phone, a guy who was described as an ordinary citizen. When the man put up a bit of resistance, he beat him so badly he lost an eye. And he was convicted then and given an 8-year prison sentence because he was only 20 at the time, Leroy Dumbrell, but he'd already amassed something like 50 criminal convictions. And that would start, I suppose, a long pattern that we've spoken about, where Leroy Dumbrell would spend most of his time out of prison. He would be in and out, get out for a period of time, commit some act of violence, and would end up back behind bars. He, unlike his brothers, I suppose, he was what could be described as an associate of the members of the Brian Rattigan gang. He certainly palled around with them in prison, provided a bit of protection for them, but also when he was out in or around the Inchicore area, he was associating with, I suppose, what would be the junior members of that gang. He would have acted, I suppose, as muscle for them to an extent. He was a known drug user, and even the most recent event where he attacked a man, again, that would have been associated with a certain amount of drug crime that was being committed in that area. His other brother, Thomas, has certainly not come before the courts for a long time, but he would have had a number of convictions, and he suffered very severe facial injuries after there was an explosion in his home. I think it was a gas leak. And then there was another brother, Leonard Dumbrell,
Leonard Dumbrell last appeared before the courts in recent years for a conviction of dangerous driving. He had a suspended sentence reactivated because he was caught with no insurance or licence. And at that time, Gorey District Court, because he was living in Gorey, this is in 2022, heard that he had 140 previous convictions and a reputation for violence while in prison. So he has obviously been somebody that's come in and out of the court system and the prison system as well. That's 5 brothers, it's all with the same trajectory in life and that same kind of...
Yeah, and again, obviously, Leroy was certainly involved in a riot in Clover Hill in 2015. So they have, even when they're in the prison system, they're not... Thomas Dumbrell would be of a totally different category in terms of the level of convictions and the seriousness of those convictions as well.
And one of the brothers, from memory, was on a reality show or was...
Yeah, I mean, we don't name...
on a reality show.
Yeah, we don't name him because he genuinely has absolutely...
Nothing to do with them.
No, and has lived a totally different life, has had no involvement in anything of that type.
Change his name.
Well, actually, Leroy Dumbrell changed his name, and you can see him even in his recent conviction as Leroy Roche or Leroy Roche Dumbrell. But yeah, the other brother, I don't think he's changed his name, but fair play to him. It has to be said, it's even more admirable to come from those surroundings and go on and not become involved yourself.
Yeah, it must be. I mean, look. Obviously there's also other members of the family as well, the extended family that aren't involved in crime. But it is quite extraordinary to see so many of them go down the same route with that same sort of personality issues and that same anger against the system and that same ability to... That
same volatility.
Yeah. People go to prison and they'll say to you that you kind of have... you can make it work for yourself by basically you've no control in prison, so you're better off just putting your head down, doing your time and getting out of there, and it makes life easier for you if you're not causing trouble. But the Dumbrells seem to do exactly the opposite within the prison system. Now, Warren Dumbrell, the prison system has worked very hard on trying to calm him down. And there was outrage some years ago when they spent a certain amount of money, tens of thousands, I think, on a sort of a calming garden for him.
Yeah.
He's also had a budgie.
Yeah. Which is, look, I mean, it's a funny thing, I suppose, where there was outrage, and I think he was being given a meditation time in a special room. I mean, I have total sympathy for the prison service. I mean, they have to deal with these guys. I think certainly with Warren Dumbrell.
He was being held at certain periods of time.
I mean,
in the prison, in that regime where he was, what did we call it? We were talking about the other day, some way.
Well, the barrier handling.
And also, being locked up for 23 hours a day because he was so dangerous and so volatile that he couldn't join the general population and he couldn't be in the exercise yards.
Yeah.
But then, he seems to get back into the general population, and then you hear bits and bobs about who he's knocking around with.
Fun, and of course, Leroy Dumbrell did bring a case as well to court because he was on 23-hour lockup as well, saying it was a breach of his human rights. So he actually has brought it to the High Court, as other people have in the past. But what we do here, I have heard people say about Warren Dumbrell that he is not unpleasant at times, and that he can be relatively relaxed and chatty. But that historically he could explode and become, go from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. And I did also hear that about Leroy Dumbrell, who somebody described to me as quite an intelligent sort of man, but, certainly has a frightening propensity for violence, it's described as. And they're all big, strong men, aren't they? I mean, Leroy Dumbrell, I think, is 6'2", 6'3", a big, strong, scary person. And even in his most recent crime was committed against a man who was also a serious criminal. So look, they're always named as, aren't they? It was a staple diet of the tabloid newspapers, Ireland's most dangerous families. They always got to run out, didn't they?
Well, they obviously only gather or meet or have family, get-togethers in prison these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose in one way, at least they have one another.
Yes, indeed they do.
We'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.